Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming today. The workshop title is How to Make a Multi-Stakeholder Model Work, Case Study on the Philippine National ICT Ecosystem Framework. Our moderator is the Regional Policy Manager of Asia Pacific from ISO. Let's welcome Ms. Noelle de Guzman.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for staying to the last session of the Taiwan IGF. I realized that this is one of the 2 last sessions, so you get a special award from Kuwait for making it through this session. All right, so I am Noelle, and I work with the Internet Society. We are a global not-for-profit, and we work in different disciplines across the internet landscape. One of them is policy advocacy. So we advocate for policies that promote an open and trusted internet. We also are very active through the Internet Engineering Task Force in open standards promotion as well as open standards development. And we are also actively involved in building the internet, so to speak, especially in areas that need it most. So this is the connecting the unconnected part of our work. So I'm delighted. I'm really happy to be having this conversation in Taiwan today because, as I think all of us know, Taiwan has been getting praise internationally for having a government that is leading the use of digital technologies to enhance democratic processes in Taiwan. So before we start with the discussion, I was wondering, is there anyone in the room that would need a recap of what we mean when we say multi-stakeholder? Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. Okay, so I assume we all have a good idea maybe of what multi-stakeholder is. As many of us know, the internet really is we all know and we all say it that it's a decentralized and it's a global network of networks, and this really necessitated from the very beginning a governance approach that respects and that enhances and that is compatible with this kind of architecture, which made the multi-stakeholder approach an ideal model. When we think about it, when we say multi-stakeholder, it wasn't actually invented by the people who were, involved in the internet space. It's a very old concept, and they've been using it since the 1950s, 1970s. When you talk about when people formulate and governments formulate policies on, say, the allocation of water resources, and things that have something to do with the commons, which is something that the internet also is. Since then, the multi-stakeholder approach has been the default mechanism in discussing concerns and coming up with decisions with regards to how the internet is managed and how the internet is overseen overall. A good example of how this is made to work, or how this works in the technical space, is the Internet Engineering Task Force. Who here is not familiar with what the Internet Engineering Task Force is? Okay, we are. I'm really happy because I don't have to explain. Okay, all right. So we know that the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the IETF, adopts a very bottom-up and consensus-based process. So it's very open, and anyone, as long as you have some basic understanding of the language that they speak, you can contribute to standards development, and you can put in your own ideas on what protocols of the future should look like to make networks connect to each other, etc. And it's important to emphasize how this is so different from the standards development process that we know traditionally. If you look at telecom standards formulation, for example, these are usually deliberated in closed doors. So this is governments and the big telecom companies coming together and shutting the door behind them, and then they would come up with treaties. So everything is negotiated on a very principled level to their benefit. Of course, championing the benefit of private sector and of governments on behalf of citizens. And then these standards have to be ratified in formal bodies like the International Telecommunications Union. Since I would say the World Summit for Information Society, the WSIS, in 2003 and 2005, where the multi-stakeholder approach for internet governance was, I would say, institutionalized, it has gained a lot of traction. So we not only see it in the technical space, but also almost every agreement and institutional document on when it comes to internet governance has multi-stakeholder in it, whether it's in the African Union, whether it's the OECD's documents and reports, whether it's the World Economic Forum, UN bodies as well, like UNESCO. And a lot of governments, you have Brazil, you have Australia, etc., committing, India, publicly committing to the multi-stakeholder framework. So what I was hoping we would focus on today is that you have all of these governments in various ways saying that yes, agreeing that the internet governance really should have a multi-stakeholder approach, but is it actually being practiced? No, that part is not well documented yet, and that is what we're trying to do with the initiatives that we're involved in, is really to try and tell the world how governments are doing it so that other governments can learn as well. So with that in mind, I would like to turn to our first contributor, Mr. Benj Sevilla, who wears a lot of hats, by the way, and whose title is constantly changing. So I'm not even going to attempt to try and see what his new title is. But Benj, please feel free to let us know. But he's with, among other hats that Benj wears, he is the chief of staff, of the infrastructure division of the Department of ICT in the Philippines. So Benj was one of the main proponents of the multi-stakeholder approach within the Department of ICT in the ICT's work, and he was also one of the I would say the people within the ICT leading the use of the multi-stakeholder approach for the national ICT ecosystem framework of the Philippines. So Benj, can you tell us more about the NICTEF, what we call the document NICTEF, and how did the DICT decide what drove the DICT to adopt this approach, and what can you see are the difference from the outcomes in adopting this approach versus other policy policy formulating methods?
Right, thank you, Noel, for.
No. Sorry, Benj. Can you stop for a bit? We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. Sorry. Okay, now. Oh no, we still can't hear you. Okay.
He was the Vice President for Administration, so that's why we're able to really get in touch with Internet Society. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I understand that this is one of the last sessions of Taiwan IGF. Congratulations for holding the Taiwan IGF there. But I do hope that we'll be able to bring home a lot, especially on the promotion and maybe documenting, like what Noel has been saying, the multi-stakeholderism, which for us in the government in the Philippines, especially in the Department of ICT, may loosely refer to the different processes involving public consultations and or generally requesting for inputs and comments from the general citizenry. In the Philippine use case, there's an early realization of the evolving role of government, especially in democracies, in advancing national interest in pursuit of developmental targets of inclusive growth, be it in internet governance or ICT policies and other platforms. Like what Noel has said, with this, the Department of ICT, that's one of the newest ministries actually here in the Philippines. We're only around 3 years old. Earlier this year, we launched the National ICT Ecosystem Framework, or NICTEF. This effectively updates the Philippine digital strategies, which we earlier pegged from 2011 to 2016. We did not put a year in NICTEF, eventually because we are envisioning it to be a living document contributory to the realization of an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development of the Philippines, with reviews and updates driven by inputs, again, inputs from stakeholders. This can be accessed through the NICTEF website, ictecosystem.org.ph. We envision that in such a way that multi-stakeholderism will be practical in that manner. But going in the question of Noel on how we are able to develop the NICTEF using the multi-stakeholder approach, we realized that NICTEF, we've been talking about multi-stakeholderism for the longest time, but there has been really not much documentation about it and around it. So the Philippines actually just put on our best foot forward and made sure that we employ the different practices that embodies multi-stakeholderism. NICTEF is a sort of a realization of this model, this absolute model of the multi-stakeholder process at work. It actually codifies the government's commitment towards setting up a robust ICT and the different emerging industries, collectively referred to as ICT. The DICT has many plans and programs, and this make up the different pieces of the puzzle that NICTEF intends to put together. This approach also allows the different actors to interact in synergy, aimed at increasing the country's ranking in terms of ICT and development. How we did NICTEF? We generally have around four different, we can generally look into four different major milestones. We did a lot of preliminary activities like footprinting. I think this is a technical term in policy making wherein we try to test the waters. We try to look into the different aspects, especially those from the countryside, because they have very different priorities as compared to those in the central locations. We also employed a lot of FGDs, or focus group discussions. This happened in central Manila. However, we were able to solicit inputs nationwide by doing an online public survey. This run for about a month, wherein we have had around 200 responses from many different age groups, many different sectors. Truly, this is a multi-stakeholder process at work. But aside from that, the definition of multi-stakeholderism, again, especially in the Philippine law, is loosely referred to as a public consultations, because through public consultations, we're able to invite a number of different stakeholders from different agencies, stakeholder groups, ranging from the youth, from the different sectors, etc. We did 4 consultations. This is one of the very first plans in the Philippines, especially in ICT and in technology-related plans that we were able to do, because as you may know, Philippines is composed of around 7,000 islands. For us to cover the 7,000 islands, we focus on the major island groups. There are 3. So we did consultations in all of those. And we are happy to announce that we have already launched NICTEF last February 2019. I guess a downloadable version is available at the website of the ICT. This has been done with the generous support of Internet Society as one of our primary co-authors of NICTEF. With NICTEF, the DICT was able to share to the Philippine industries and of course to our neighbors in Asia Pacific our defining outlook on the significance of data as a government asset, especially for policy making and access empowerment. One thing to note, however, when doing this when employing multi-stakeholderism, there might be a sort of resistance at the start, because governments, as you may know, may have a preconceived notion of, we know what's best for the people, we know what we should do. But I guess it takes a lot of pushing papers and, how do I say? pushing papers and just really advocating for it continually, that it eventually be streamlined in the processes. With NICTEF, the DICT seeks not only to more substantially engage and provide for a meaningful participation of a more diverse set of stakeholders. We also wanted to foster this notion of inclusive bottom-up initiatives by encouraging the stakeholders themselves to set the agenda and the priorities and the different projects of the Philippine government through a national digital strategy. This is actually consistent with DICT's policy to ensure the provision of citizen-centric ICT infrastructure systems and resources, which forms part of the good governance cycle and global competitiveness. Just to sum up, I think we've covered NICTEF. We formulated and developed NICTEF for around a year. This is actually a good turnaround time already for those employing the multi-stakeholder process, especially noting that ICT is a wide field and there's a lot of voices that can be heard. So,
Thank you very much. Which one? Okay. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much, Benj. I wanted to flash on the screen actually because there. Okay, so Benj was talking about this. This is we did a case study on NICTEF, which will be published very soon. But when he was talking about the process, he was referring to this. So it was roughly more than a year process from the digital footprinting, and then you have awareness building, focus groups discussion, and then more awareness building up until, and then you have the regional consultations, and then the launch of NICTEF. Obviously, this is not. This is only one of the various arrangements and the various methods that we can use when we talk about employing the multi-stakeholder approach in policy making. Benj, I realize that you have other commitments today, so I will let you go now. Thank you very much. Thanks, Benj. All right. So Benj can have his weekend back. Okay. All right. So I'd like to. Are there any initial comments or questions at this point? No questions and comments. Okay. All right. So I'd like to turn to Joyce actually. So Joyce, ICANN, from, as we know from the time from the very beginning, essentially, ICANN has been one of the top proponents of and also practicing the multi-stakeholder approach as a global organization, and one of the ways that this was demonstrated more recently was, of course, the transition of the IANA functions supervision to the global community. So Joyce, having worked with ICANN, but also having been exposed to how governments operate in the region, are there any practices within ICANN that you think would be suitable for governments to adopt at the local level, but also at the regional and the global level that you are not seeing yet? Oh, please.
Okay. Actually, hi everybody, I'm Joyce. I see familiar faces from this morning, but for those who don't know me yet, so I'm Joyce Chen from ICANN, from the APAC regional office, and I'm actually from Singapore, so I just came down for this event. Basically what I do is I look after engagement in certain of the APAC countries, and so thank you for having me here, and thank you for giving me the time to speak to you. Actually, Noah, I looked at you because I thought it might be useful to just do a quick summary of NICTEF, because I thought maybe that part was not so clear when Benj went through. But I'll answer your question first, and then after that we'll come back to it. So why ICANN and why is ICANN in this session? If you're not too familiar, it's really because ICANN operates with a multi-stakeholder model. So governments as a stakeholder are actually part of our model, but they don't drive the model. So this is different from in countries where governments usually take the position that they are looking after the sovereign right of the country and looking after or protecting citizens. For ICANN, we function differently because we function from bottom up. So what that means is, let's say there is an issue that's related to how the internet works or related to the domain name system. So the DNS meaning basically how IP addresses and domain names are coordinated, how the internet actually runs. These issues are brought up by the ICANN community and not from, for example, governments. So usually in a national setting, the government is the one that sets the agenda. So to say, for example, if let's say now Taiwan is talking about fake news, right, fake information, but who is driving this conversation? Why is it suddenly becoming more noticed by citizens? Is it because the citizens started talking a lot about it and then the government took notice? Or is it because the government is actually the one that raised the topic that they want the citizens to then talk about? So in Singapore's case, it is the second one. It is pretty much, in Singapore, it was the government said, okay, fake news is a problem, we define it, and now we hand you the legislation. So for the citizens, we actually have very little input into this discussion. So this is the typical way governments run. Not to say that in Taiwan it's the same, but for ICANN itself, the multi-stakeholder model, it's quite the opposite. Actually, governments have very little in terms of developing policy in ICANN itself. The role of governments is really just to provide advice on public policy impact. So let's say ICANN comes up with a policy, they want to do something. This policy is open to everyone to discuss, to talk about, and then governments will also be able to advise on the policy, but they cannot say, I want the policy to be like this. So it's very different. And the way that ICANN works, basically, as Noel mentioned, it reflects how the internet came about in the first place. It came from a bottom-up process. It came from industry. And so it's important for us when we are functioning that we protect the multi-stakeholder model. Because if you think about it, there are not many things in the world right now that are multi-stakeholder in nature. The internet is one of those very few precious resources that runs differently. So now I've said this, are there different kinds of multi-stakeholder models? Yes, there are. So ICANN is not the only multi-stakeholder model that you can follow, and when you think of multi-stakeholder model, it doesn't mean that it must be the ICANN one. IETF, so the Internet Engineering Task Force, has their own model. They have a slightly different way of operating, but the principles are the same. So meaning issues come up from community, they discuss it, they develop policy, how they vote, how they decide, how they choose consensus might be different from ICANN, but the principles are the same, right? So in this context, how do you talk about multi-stakeholder model in a country context? When we think about, that governments have a role to play, citizens have a role to play, and it's very uncomfortable when you want to talk about multi-stakeholder in a national setting because you are disrupting the relationships, right? It's citizens, you come out and say, I want to have a say in issues that matter to me, and I want to be the decision maker. In a national setting, unfortunately, and from our experience engaging with governments, this is very difficult. In Asia, this is even more difficult because of our culture. We are more comfortable with when things are decided top-down. So you just tell me what to do and then I'll do it. That's the kind of culture that we are used to here, which we are slowly changing. But we can borrow from the principles of multi-stakeholder model. So for example, how open and how transparent is a country when they develop policy. When your government is coming up with new legislations or new policies, do they make the extra effort to open it up for the citizens and the public to comment on it? Means to give their views, to explain to the government, this is how this policy impacts me. So one principle of multi-stakeholder model is first, it's open, meaning anybody from any background should be able to talk about this issue as long as they feel that it impacts them, right? The other one is transparency. So to be open, you must also be transparent. You have to document your processes. If you have a comment process, if you ask for people or you consult people, it should be in a very transparent manner. And all decisions and all discussions should be documented and available for everyone to look at. So of course, in a national setting, this can be difficult because you have confidential matters, etc., etc. So sometimes there are things that cannot be revealed to the public. And that is within the government's right to do it. But there are other ways to press the government to be more transparent about things. So, you know, like if let's say you have decided on something, what was the method that you went about to decide this? Why did this law come about? Where did it come from? So they should document it and then have an arena for people to talk about it. So open, transparent, inclusive is the same as being, is part of the whole idea of being open. I mean, I think these are some of the principles that we can learn from the multi-stakeholder model and try to make it more effective in our own nations. So I'm not here to tell you Taiwan should operate like ICANN because we are the multi-stakeholder model, and I think that is an impossible vision because that's just not the way the countries are run. But I think we can learn from the multi-stakeholder model, and I think the Philippines example for how they're doing it is fantastic because it shows that there is a deep relationship and trust between the government and the internet community. So what I want you to think about in this session is, what is the level of trust in Taiwan? Do you trust the government enough to have that dialogue with the government on important issues and have the government in the same room and then be able to listen to their views just as well as they're listening to yours? So what is your dialogue experience like? I think in the Philippines, they have kind of reached like a very high level of dialogue already because the government understands the multi-stakeholder model. So there's a lot of educating to do. Sorry, I took very long.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Joyce. You raised a lot of very, very good points. Kuo, you wanted to comment on that.
Okay. I actually start. Okay, go ahead to count. Okay, I try to start from the very beginning of ICANN and what's that happened in 1998, because I can run in the multi-stakeholder how it happened. I think everybody know that in the very beginning of before ICANN actually ionized operation by the U.S. government. Okay, and so globally. You know, from European, many of the countries complain about the U.S. government have a privilege to run the internet. So there is a lot of pressure and also the requirement asking the U.S. government to open up the IN operation. Okay. And at that time, in the 1998, what's that happened? The U.S. government, they have to resolve the international problem regarding for the IN operations. So in 1998, actually the U.S. government gave funding, not really funding, actually they created a called new corporation. And somehow they hire a very famous law professor called Roland Lessig. Why hire Roland Lessig? Because Roland Lessig is he's a specialist in a constitution. Okay. And Kenny Huang presented several times of the Roland Lessig's chart. If you remember that in the Roland Lessig's famous chart, He's talking about the order. The social order is based on the law, market, norm, and then in the internet with another is code. And code is we're talking about the technical expert. Remember that when the Lowland Lessig to design this one, because first of all, ICANN is not government. ICANN is not an international organization with a treaty. So how the ICANN really can operation and they still can push the policy is workable. So that is from the constitution point of view, Lowland Lessig recommend. This is a chart, it's a multi-stakeholder. So the multi-stakeholder recommendation is actually from the Lowland Lessig. And of course, there is also add on one particular case is very important, is IETF. IETF is much earlier than ICANN. And IETF actually, they are operation based on the, the transparent and also the global engineer to developing this kind of the consensus for IFC. So Lowland Lessig actually merged the IETF and also the ICANN specialists. So let's generate the bylaw, the so-called constitution of the ICANN. I just try to finish quick. So this guy keep watching the watch, okay? I think last year, around the Christmas, I actually invited Marcus Krumer to Taiwan, talking about the multi-stakeholder and also the multilateralism. I think the people here, you have to be careful about that. Multi-stakeholder is not everything. Multi-stakeholder, you cannot replace the government. You cannot replace the international organizations. So what is a multi-stakeholder actually fit into the currently the government structure or fit into the international organization? Here is how the multi-stakeholder, particularly ICANN, is doing. Basically, ICANN actually is try to be transparent, bottom up. The reason is very simple, because ICANN is not government. They don't have a military, they don't have a police, they don't have a court, they don't have a judge to make a final decision. So they have to go to the consensus. The consensus comes from all the multi-stakeholder. If the consensus is reached, then even they are not a government, these policies can be executed, can be processed. Okay, so this is a very important thing. Why they need a transparent, they need to button up, why they need to, to do that way. And now we need to make a relationship between the multi-stakeholder and link to the so-called government process. In January, we are expecting the multi-stakeholder actually try to do the discussion of the problem, the governance problem. And when the governance problem, then hopefully we can come out with a consensus. Then we come out with a so-called policy recommendation. Finally, if this policy recommendation with a consensus, we wish the government or international organization accept that. And now you can from policy to execution. So I think, remember, multi-stakeholder mechanism doesn't replace government, didn't replace the international organization. We end up by the policy recommendation. So even the ICANN making the policy, remember that some of them we go to the GSE. GSE still can say, no, we don't want to do that. Okay. And why that is a multi-stakeholder will be help for every government. Because we knew that in the internet, the governance is a big trouble. It's a lot of issues. And eventually the people find it, if we want to solve the internet problem, multi-stakeholder is one of the possible way to resolve the problem. So I think let me finish here.
Thank you very much.
Is that okay, Kenny?
All right, thank you very much. So before we progress with the conversation, I would just like to address what Joyce requested earlier, is to provide a summary of what NICTEF is. So essentially, NICTEF is a document, it's a framework that lays the direction for how ICT should develop in the Philippines. Where you have different priority areas, like it talks about how the Philippines should approach emerging technologies, how it should be used, etc. It talks about what should the priorities be for countryside development in using ICTs. It's now on the implementation phase. The development phase was when a lot of consultations with the whole country happened. And the bench mentioned that it's a living document. It's actually not. It's not a term that the Philippines invented. We see that in a couple of policy documents as well, meaning that it doesn't have an end date. So sometimes we see that there's a framework for 19 something to 20 something. NICTEF doesn't have that end date. And what the government is trying to do is that it has set up a website for NICTEF, and that's where you can see how the initiatives under NICTEF are progressing. And also, throughout the implementation of NICTEF, they're going to review, so they're going to hold more meetings and more gatherings with different stakeholders to review and recalibrate with the changing times and with the changing technologies, how to approach ICT development as time progresses. So that is it essentially. So I really like what Kowe and Joyce was talking about how while there are some principles, we go back to the principles as opposed to having a model, because principles are more adaptable. And if you think about it, it's more palatable, no? If you just ask government can you be a little more transparent? All right, so talking about transparency and openness, I'm going to turn to our next speakers, Yingchu and Kenny, to tell us a bit more about how this is being operationalized in Taiwan. So you have PDIS, among other initiatives, that is really, I've seen PDIS websites. I've heard, I've read some of the digital ministers' articles talking about the initiatives in Taiwan, and I was hoping to ask you, based on what has been discussed so far, and I know that PDIS adheres to these principles that Joyce has mentioned, or being open, being transparent, and being inclusive. But internationally, from as a foreigner in Taiwan, all I know is there are a lot of articles about it, praising how it is. But I wanted to know, in your perspective, from the ground, or on the ground, how effective are these processes so far, and is there anything that you think is worth replicating in other countries or for other countries? Oh yes.
No, that's my note. Okay, there's some history about Taiwan. Taiwan has there are many active communities in Taiwan. So we have GDV, they are famous, and before we have Code Tomorrow, and I'm one of member in Code for Tomorrow. Yeah. So in 2014, we have smart government event to have a dialogue with government, and at that time we didn't know what is multi-stakeholder. Yeah, we just try to open a place to talk with government and want to have more opinions to provide to them. But we have different stakeholders like UX designer and service designer to to make some awareness to them about government website to make it more friendly and accessibility to people. And then there's some event happen to Taiwan. So government want to government sees some benefit with to cooperate with civil society. So we have some people from GDV join the government official to help them with some internet technology. So I think that a transformation, the first step to have our government transformation with digital technology. So and we just start. I think we just beginning to have this, and we need more time. So PDIs do a lot to make it faster, but they do different things. They from inside to outside. GDV is from outside to inside, so that's different way. But is it good? Because with PDIs, what they have done is try to make different awareness in government officials. So I think it's good, but we need more time to wait. Something happen. Yeah. Can you?
Sorry, I'm a little bit lost. What's the topic we discussed?
I wanted.
Sorry. Okay.
So, I wanted to know your impressions about what the Taiwan government is doing to enable digital democracy. I think this is. Oh, sorry, you're being recorded. So maybe I was going to say it. So yes, please.
Okay, just remind me what we're going to do. Anyway, basically, from government point of view, when I talk to several ministers, and basically from their point of view, Taiwan actually doing multi-stakeholder model pretty well, even from government point of view. And because when they're talking about a lot of new high-tech or a lot of new policy, they always say multi-stakeholder model from their perspective. For example, like a sharing economy, and they say they are follow multi-stakeholder model. And I talked to them, actually, you are not follow multi-stakeholder model. It's multi-beneficiary model. Because you're only looking for someone who are beneficiary to the policy. It's not really to talking to someone who are real stakeholder. So that's something they're missing. They saw they are multi-stakeholder model, but it's multi-beneficiary model. So that's one thing, and I believe they try to improve. But the problem is, for example, like a sharing service, sharing economy, when they're talking to Ministry of Transportation and Communication, when they're talking to taxi industry, and then talking to Uber company, and they're only talking to these two kind of stakeholder, but they didn't talk to the consumer. They didn't talk to the rider. So the problem happened because they think, from their perspective, naturally government should protect the consumer. So the government can act on behalf of the consumer. So they just ignore any input from the consumer and just act on behalf of the consumer. Direct talking to taxi company, taxi industry, and talking to Uber. But basically, we don't hear any voice from the consumer, except the government, they fake their voice. They say they are act on behalf of the consumer. So that was something really, really wrong. And on the other side, when we're talking about government always exists. Of course, the multi-stakeholder model definitely cannot replace the government. That's for sure. But the problem is, in some certain area, the multi-stakeholder model really effective and really go beyond jurisdiction. For example, like cybersecurity. Basically, I probably mentioned this in a previous section. When we talked to CIA, FBI, they already totally abandoned the existing tool from traditional cybercrime investigation process, because the traditional tool is something like MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Actually, it's not very effective. It took months, took years to forward the MLAT notice from one country to the other country. But consider from cybercrime point of view, basically it's very easy to jump different country in a few seconds. So the traditional tool that is totally abandoned by this guy, because they're fully aware the traditional way of doing cybercrime investigation doesn't work. So they need to create different way. For example, like an internet governance model. They try to approach different stakeholders and try to establish different solutions, try to discuss through internet policy process to see whether the process can be get more insight for the cybercrime prevention. So that's the other way they're trying to do. So just try to correct. Probably the traditional world was still based on the jurisdiction, but in the cyberspace, there are some potential in the way we work to each other. For example, like a multi-stakeholder model could be one step beyond the traditional way they're doing business. Yeah, just my few comments.
Thank you. Oh, Kuo-wei, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think basically I just add something on top of the Kenny talking about it. This is really true. Is I think not only in Taiwan, in most of the Asia countries have the same problems. When we are trying to say, we try to implement a multi-stakeholder mechanism, first of all, multi-stakeholder is not in our culture. You know, we don't know what is a stakeholder mean. Kenny actually point out that, for example, like a Uber issue in Taiwan. The console actually missing the very important part is a consumer, because eventually, or for example, the driver, no matter is a taxi driver or Uber driver, okay. And more than that, particularly in the internet governance issue, it's very important thing. You also need a technical expert to come in, because if you based on the Lowland-Lessig chart, because the core is there. So why in most of the place in the multi-stakeholder mechanism, they try to include a technical expert. Okay, so you can see that you go to the ICANN. ICANN, there is at least they have two board members, actually from an expert. One is from IETF, another one, I don't remember, IAB or something like that. And they also have two committees. One is the RSEC, another one is the SSEC. Because that is very important to make sure your mechanism is workable. Only technical expert can tell you it's workable or not. So that is very often to be ignored or happen in our culture, in Asia cultures. So I think that is a very important thing. Is we're still learning how to define the stakeholder is. And Kenny, I agree about that. Yeah, in some of the part actually is not necessarily need to be decided by, the government. For example, the mobile standard. We know the mobile standard is not defined by ITU. It's by 3GPP. 3GPP is not an international organization. For example, the internet standard is from IETF, the IFC. And IETF definitely is not the government or international organization. So I think that is we have a lot to learn, particularly in the Asia regions. We have to learn what is a stakeholder mean. And just like Kenny say, this not only happen in Taiwan. In Taiwan, our government say, we are doing the multi-stakeholder. But If you look carefully, not really true. Actually, Uber case is one of that. Airbnb is another problem. Airbnb, the government is invite the hotel association, and then maybe they are talking with, the Airbnb, the rental housing, something like that. But they never ask, or they talk to the Airbnb, sorry. But they never talk or, get the information from consumer. Or they never talk to, I have apartment, I just list into the Airbnb. He didn't ask me, such like that. So there's a basically problem. I mean, it's not only in Taiwan, in all the Asia countries have their problems. We don't know how to define the stakeholder. And I think if we want to improve this multi-stakeholder, and then we also need to understand why the multi-stakeholder is good. The multi-stakeholder is good because all the multi-stakeholder, we actually, the final goal is that we try to developing a policy is the best for the public interest. Remember that. We try to solve the public interest, and that if the final policy is not benefit to the public interest, that is not good policy. I think we have to understand why we need a multi-stakeholder, because we want to solve the public interest.
Thank you very much, Go Wei. Are there any comments at this point? Oh, okay.
Okay, I found one thing is very different from NICTAP and Taiwan's case. The case in Taiwan is always in the end of the whole consumption chain. So like we are consumers, so we say that public interest, and we talk about this. But it's very different from NICTAP. NICTAP is about the industry and education strategy and policy. But that's totally different.
Right.
So, and NICTAP is high level, and the I'm not being the Uber is low level, but it is consumer side.
I see.
Yes, that's different, but that's very difficult to use citizen to have opinions to the industrial development.
Right.
Yeah, very difficult in Taiwan. So Taiwan government says, yes, we have a multi-stakeholder, but they have their own definition in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's two different. Yes.
So I like the and I've encountered this a lot of times, is the, I wouldn't say it's a barrier, but it's a difference in culture. Well, I remember when one time in Japan, we were trying to convene a multi-stakeholder dialogue. And our Japan chapter was saying, how, well, and I was telling them, should we invite, who should we invite? This sector, and then, because it was a topic that was consumer-oriented, it was going to be on IoT security for consumers. I was suggesting that maybe it would also be good to have civil society, civil society organizations, and just members of civil society present, so they can, their suggestions would be very useful. And then they get back to me saying, there is no civil society in Japan. Of course there is, but as a body, it's not that organized, and they're not very vocal. And I think you can see this throughout Asia, even when we were doing NICTAF in the Philippines, whereas we have similar initiatives in Canada, etc. In the Philippines, you really have to force people to talk. So oh yeah, exactly. In India, the problem is to stop them. But so India is also a remarkable case study, because when they mobilize, like in the net neutrality, they can really do things. And it's a robust population as well. So that is, I guess, one of the things that we can learn from India. But I agree. I totally agree. The other bit about the other point that you mentioned about we don't really know like who the stakeholders should be and who the stakeholders are. And I think that's also very important because we take it for granted in the internet community that, you know, this is a process, but then you have these institutions which have been closed off for such a long time, working in silos, they're not even talking to each other, and then you suddenly ask them to open up. We've been conducting in the past 2 years or so, we started conducting internet governance courses for policymakers. And so far, we've had very good feedback. But our problem now, we're a relatively small organization, is that you also you get into a space locally where you don't only have to talk to the Ministry of ICT. Everyone is now involved in policy making for the internet. You mentioned the Department of Transportation. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is also dealing with security issues. You have the police, the national police, talking about cybercrime. So, you know, and a lot of these governments, I don't know how it is in Taiwan, and I'd like to hear more about it. A lot of these government agencies also have their own culture and their way of working. So, I mean, where do we really start? And the other thing is, I think governments have these proclamations of, you know, yes, we are a multi-stakeholder government. We stand by the multi-stakeholder approach. But so far, what we found is some issues, like you also emphasized, some issues are better than others. Well, some governments are more responsive to the multi-stakeholder approach as an approach for some issues more than others. One example is Australia. Australia, in its cyber strategy, I think that's all that it's called. The cyber strategy of Australia, it really says in writing that all of our policies, etc., should be following the multi-stakeholder approach. And then last year they come up with the Encryption and Access Bill, which is now a law. So that bill was essentially to allow governments, it's not to break, okay, they're qualifying it, this is not breaking encryption, but it's allowing governments, it's to compel organizations, manufacturers, providers, etc., internet service providers to devise tools and mechanisms allowing government and allowing authorities to access encrypted content. So it's essentially breaking encryption. And that bill was pummeled through Parliament, and stakeholders had to, including the public and the private sector, had to force it open to consultations. Basically, they closed it off, and then they really want it rushed as soon as possible, and then eventually they agree that, okay, maybe we will have some discussions. The bill, I think the local discussions managed to convince some politicians to maybe dilute the bill a little, but eventually it was passed. So it was passed at the end of the year. And we don't only see this in Australia. We see that especially when it comes to security issues. And Kenny, I think you mentioned that there are really some spaces and some topics that are in the government domain, so to speak, and they're not likely to let go of that. Do we think that there are acceptable and there are natural limits to how we can and where we can practice or have multi-stakeholder principles within government processes? Or should we keep on pushing? Should we keep on pushing them open?
Yeah, actually, the first thing I want to clarify is I'm not really, when I'm talking about India, it's not negative. I'm
Yes, of
talking
course.
about the Indian is a positive because the Indian, they really, the culture, they have culture, they are very easy to, if they have something want to say, they are open say it, they don't care, I think that is a very, if you want to implement the multi-stakeholder mechanism in India, I think it's quite easy, And second of all, the one thing I want to particularly is I want to listen to them to ask, So if anyone, can I speak in Chinese?
Of course.
假设你们有问题，你们可以用中文问，然后我们可以帮你翻译，没有问题。所以我鼓励你们问问题，这样子我想我这个讨论才会更有趣。Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry you are speaking, you are sitting so close to Koei. That's why. Now you have to talk.
I just have a few comments because, well, I'm from an anthropology background, and in anthropology, I think most people don't know how anthropology works or what do we study. We study culture, so we are very cautious when we use the word culture, and I really don't like how it's represented. And well, it's not like I don't like. I find it really interesting how people are talking about culture in this context. And I think it's not very helpful when you're always saying like, oh, this thing is not our culture, or oh, this thing is not in our culture, because let's say democracy, it wasn't in anyone's culture. It was invented by human beings. And eventually some adapted the culture, right? And also, let's say, a lot of people are arguing like gay marriage wasn't our culture in Taiwan, so we should be opposed to gay marriage. But that's not the thing. We shouldn't be using culture as an excuse to blame someone for not doing something, or to, just to say that, oh, it's not our culture, so we can't do it, or it's not our culture, so it's hard to push it. I think it's more helpful if we just, do it, instead of saying that somebody's not willing to do it because they don't know how to do it. Let's just teach them, right? It's not like how we should do it. And also, I don't think a lot of people are talking about government doesn't do things, or they don't listen to people, and they don't know what everything's about. But there are a lot of multi-stakeholder practices that doesn't involve government. I remember reading actually from ISOC, the Korean cases. There was this Korean case where, because the Korean government, they were doing this real name thing in the internet, and the people actually gathered to sue the court, like this is not constitutional. And this is a multi-stakeholder process. It just doesn't involve government, because government was the one doing the thing, right? And of course, the Australian cases you were talking about, it wasn't about government. Well, government wasn't part of the process either, because it was the one who caused this situation. So, of course, government, in a lot of cases, government is important, but there are a lot of cases too that multi-stakeholder works, and it doesn't have to involve government. And a lot of people are saying, oh, there's no multi-stakeholder cases in Taiwan, but well, on the top of my head, I could think of at least two. One is the tax reporting system innovation. Well, not innovation, like updating tax reporting system. It happened last year, right? And this year, a lot of people are saying that, oh, wow, the tax reporting system this year is a lot user-friendly, and it was initiated by a multi-stakeholder practice, and it was successfully done through a multi-stakeholder process too. And also, legalizing gay marriage is one of the cases. It's similar to the Korean case too. So I think that's my few comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manju. And I think that's why it's important to have different voices in the room, because none of us are in anthropology. Oh, yes.
Hi, hi everyone. I'm from NII. I personally involved in researching topics related to cybersecurity. And I think because I personally have read something about intelligence studies, so somewhat contrary to my colleague has said, I do believe that in terms of governance, let's say internet governance, when some issues has fallen into the turf of security, especially when the spy agencies are involved, I think it will be very difficult. I believe they will definitely step in and try to, for various reasons, one of them being secrecy and being prevention of the leak, they will definitely step in, and they will, I think, but maybe it's case by case, on a case by case basis, they will step in to make sure that no one other than their unit can have a say in this.
Let me quickly respond. And I think you raised a good point, because there will always be limitations in systems, and for good reason. For many reasons, one of them of which is protection of the citizens, for example. But I think for the multi-stakeholder process, if we go back to principles, I think the idea is more the intersection with citizens and with people, with users, for me, is more on for example, in this case, the government done due process, right? And is it accountable? So when things do happen, how do we hold people, how do we hold governments accountable? So that's also one of the principles of the multi-stakeholder model, where by reaching consensus, you're not just owning the problem. So owning a problem meaning everybody comes to the table and everybody discusses what the problem is, many views, and then come out with consensus. But it is also about owning the solution. So then, after that is done, you have to be able to own the solution and be able to collectively say, now we are all accountable for this thing.
We're not stopping. It's not multi-stakeholder.
No, we try to listen to other voices. You can speak in Chinese, don't worry. 用中文问没问题。
Okay, I will try to first address my question in English, but if I can not explain it clearly, I can
understand you except for me. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I'm a student from the Department of Political Science, and I think this kind it's my first time to get in touch of internet governance. And I think this kind of issue is not discussed much in my department. So I have a question. You said that you have to use multi-stakeholder governance approach in this kind of issue. Maybe it's because of the deep, like like the role of the industry is very big in this kind of issue. So maybe you have to use this kind of approach. But I think that maybe why the government would not take this approach is because that they would afraid that maybe if they accept this kind of approach, maybe people will ask for this kind of approach in other issues. So maybe I think it is because they don't have enough confidence in this. So, but I think I don't really quite understand that this kind of governance approach. What big is the range of this kind of a governance approach? Maybe I think it's the key points when we try to talking to communicate with the government. But I'm curious that how do maybe ICANN or other parts, what is the way you talk to the government now?
You want to answer? Okay, go ahead.
I try to understand, but you maybe think about in different industry. So I don't think multi-stakeholder as a MS model is completely for all industry, because that is very effective in internet governance, in internet communities, even in our taxation system or join the petition platform. But that's only for internet users and communities, but not for all industry. We need to think about, especially for the public interest. So, okay, on to Joyce.
So I think it's quite interesting that you brought this up, and also from your background. So my first response to you is definitely governments will always be uncomfortable when you try to put the citizens in the picture or users in the picture, because it's about sharing power, right? So from a political science perspective, this is the main crux of the problem, that it's an issue of needing to share power among stakeholders, multi-stakeholders, and then recognizing that stakeholders have equal power and equal say in issues. So that is the fundamental difficulty that governments would face very, very naturally, because that relationship is a difficult one. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Now, I go to your second part, which is the multi-stakeholder model something that really is more useful or applicable only for internet-related issues? I would say no, not really. So let me give you an example. One day the government sends you a letter and says, we are going to build a house right through your house. We're going to build a road right through your house. And you have no say in this, even though it's your house, it's your property, right? Could this possibly happen? And do you have recourse for appeal? So that is that relationship and that dialogue. I don't really agree that multi-stakeholder approach can only be applied in very specific circumstances when the conditions are right. I think it's more of understanding the fundamentals of it and then thinking how to apply it for different situations. I think that's more the case.
Yeah, I agree with Joyce. Basically, when we try to apply multi-stakeholder model everywhere, it's not going to happen. But at least we know one place is really work very well, is internet governance. So for example, like ICANN or APNIC or any ISOC, IETF, it's worked pretty well for applying multi-stakeholder model. So when we talk to our traditional regime, like a political science or the other regime, basically they have their long tradition, the long way of solving the problem. So it's difficult to apply multi-stakeholder model. So at least from our perspective, the internet itself, for global internet itself, how we're going to governance the global internet is so far is quite effective, and so far is still quite productive from multi-stakeholder model point of view. And let me take one example. For example, like APNIC. APNIC is responsible for IP address allocation in Asia-Pacific region. And the first day when we tried to allocate resource in the Asia-Pacific region, we didn't get any international treaty. We didn't get any approval from any government at all. But we just did it. We just did it. And after a few years, it became a practice, become a common. Then we become a legitimate address allocation registry. And after allocation is already running out, we become to try to secure the routing. So we start allocate RPKI certificate. So we become an RPKI registry again. And we have a board meeting last month and discuss what we're going to do in next 10 years. And one of the mission in next 10 years is we're going to abandon the service we provide before we try to create another new one, because when we consider the cyberspace is unlimited potential, how come we just limit ourselves in some certain region? So we start to explore different kind of models to see what kind of infrastructure service going to happen for the next 10 years. We try to abandon what we did right now.
We don't agree. APNIC is a membership organization.
Yes, we are a membership organization.
All right. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. But thank you very much for your question. So from ISOC's perspective, we try to see it when we engage with the government. We try to emphasize mutual benefit. So we try to see how it will benefit them, and we try to tell them that it will benefit them this way, so that they will talk to us. But I think to conclude, sorry, I will go maybe 1 minute after. No, we started late. Okay. So I think Manju raised a very important point about culture, because I was thinking, actually was talking, are we being impatient? Because maybe even democratic institutions, especially for countries that were colonized, we are not even fully democratic yet. No, so it really takes time for these systems to settle in. And now, we have all of these governments called proxy democracies, and we are one of them. So you're, in principle, you're democratic, but really. And another example is the caste system in India. So recently, I was just reading about the caste system in India, and it's a system that has been there for thousands of years, but it was very, very fluid up until the British came in the mid-19th century. And then they made it rigid, but it took them 200 years to do it. So imagine, we are trying to promote the multi-stakeholder model since, I don't know, 1990s, 2000s, maybe in 2020, I don't even know, we won't be here anymore. But that, it means we shouldn't stop pushing. No, we shouldn't stop pushing, and we shouldn't stop what we're doing and just say, okay, governments want to do what they want, let them do what they want. No, I think when we talk about culture, think about all of the major religions here. How do they spread? The disciples, no? You have to just keep on telling them about it and see how it works, and then eventually you will convince everyone, hopefully. So thank you, everyone. Do we have a closing ceremony?
Yep. Over there.
And now it's happening. Okay, so thank you very much for sticking around. I hope that the discussion was interesting and informative. And let's all now head to the closing ceremony, hopefully for... Oh, the host! Thank you to the contributors as well. Thank you.